Hood by J M Bulpett. Read by Jack Collard. Chapter 1. Ambush. The belief that a person is near death has produced incredible stories of superhuman powers. Mothers heaving cars clear of their trapped child, isolated farm workers with severed limbs marching miles to ask help from neighbours, people with shattered bodies hauling themselves free of peril on splintering bones in a last total effort of survival. But what Robbie Ash discovered that night, although strangely he could rarely bring it into focus in his mind later, was a different species of ability. And it was the knife that opened that other self. It was the knife that opened that other life beyond. Yet, as he made his way towards the others in the park that night, all Robbie sensed and thrilled in was that he was walking on the wild side. A tall, middle-aged man walking towards the boys shuffled over to the other side of the street, rather than risk brushing past Robbie and his friend.
"What do you say?"
yelled Barney Toon across the road.
"What do you call us?" "Yeah, you keep walking."
The middle-aged man had said nothing, but now he quickened his pace, his brow furious and full of shame. Robbie shook his head at Barney. He wasn't interested in causing trouble. Besides, the man had not crossed the road due to the tiny terrier presence of Barney Toon. Even though there was a chill in the air, Robbie had been determined to wear the t-shirt that showed off his physique to its best. Robbie was already touching 6 foot, and genetics had been kind to him, gifting him decent looks and developing his body into a lightly muscular frame with a bit of bulk in his limbs and upper torso, where both males and females of his age group were impressed by it. "You have your father's build," his grandmother Gwen had told him, but Robbie wouldn't know. He had never met his father. In contrast, Barney couldn't stop yapping if his life depended upon it. Toon seemed to possess an undercooked, immature frame upon which sat an out-of-proportion balloon head so large he might have been a warped reflection in a hubcap. "You see that bright star in the south, Blanc? That's not a star at all, that's Mars."
"Couldn't give a crap, Robbie, and it's that kind of weird-ass toss that loses your friends at school."
Ever since arriving at the school 3 months ago, Barney Toon had seemed to adopt Robbie as his new best friend, but the relationship came with frequent rebuking about his weirdness.
"Normally these guys tell me to get lost, but they obviously like you, Rob. For Anthony and Billy to invite us to the park tonight, that's big, Rob."
"Why would they even want me to come? I don't hang around with them. They're the school's psychos. I heard they'd even threatened the deputy head."
"Don't ask me. But don't talk about all that Mars crap, okay? They'll end up beating on both of us. Remember, they're head cases, Rob.
So why are we going?
Do you want to turn up to school on Monday after having refused their invite? They'll probably ask you to intimidate some poor dog walker and knock back a bit of 40% proof. Don't sweat it.
Friday night at the park, swigging cheap, strong alcohol had been a tradition for the rougher teenage element in the school for at least several months before Robbie had arrived in the area. However, the police were becoming wise to the underage drinking and minor public disturbances, installing a CCTV camera just behind the lamppost. The gang would have to migrate to other spots soon, but for that night at least, the park belonged to them. Robbie Ash had been shunted around from place to place by his mother for most of his life. As a consequence, he'd not really made any reliable friends and usually felt isolated when establishing himself in a new place. The school hard men were hardly his choice of people with whom to hang around. Robbie would have preferred the cautious, wary company of the clever kids, especially as some of the girls were witty, classy, and gorgeous, but they had cliques and tended to keep their distance.
You notice Gemma is into you, lucky git. Been trying to get inside her knickers for months, but then suddenly you arrive on the scene and it's practically access all areas, Barney babbled on. Of course, I've had her best mate. He hadn't. But you're just weird and shouldn't rate a chance with Gemma. It's not fair, and if my dad had been a little taller...
Gemma likes boys with altitude rather than attitude, does she?
I could show her part of me with a bit of altitude. After your mother, of course.
How did you know my mother was into leprechauns with bowling ball-size heads, Blan?
That's not what she whispered to me over the pillow.
They were approaching Marine Parade Gardens, commonly known as the park, and Robbie was content for Barney to drone on with his mindless chatter and toothless insults. The park was a series of formal lawns, fountains, bushes and flower beds crisscrossed with winding concrete paths. Hemmed in and overlooked by balconies festooned with potted plants and twitching curtains, at night, Marine Parade Gardens might have been a particularly indulgent and peaceful prison exercise yard. Beneath a pool of light, from a single lamppost on which was trained the gaze of a CCTV camera, were the group from the school. To an uninitiated or adult eye, the group seemed random, but Robbie could distinguish a distinct hierarchy. There was a general mingling of lower-status kids and playground loons around the edge. Then, an inner circle of cooler, edgier adolescents, all of their faces turned towards the two leaders who were sat on the back of the bench beneath the stone shelter. Even the tone of the talk from a distance was threatening, with words broadcast rather than spoken and jeering laughter. When Barney and Robbie were spotted, a hush of expectation descended on the crowd. All Robbie's instincts told him to run. This was not just an invitation. This was an invitation to a specific event, and he feared that he might be somewhere on the billing. The stars around which the rest of the group were orbiting were the lanky, angular Anthony Cairns-Nash and Billy Mills, an oblong of brutality who had always been significantly bigger than his peers, as well as a bully since the age of 2. Both had reputations and older brothers with form. Billy's father and older brother were both inside serving time for different assaults or bodily harms, which, in itself, carried a certain prestige amongst the impressionable and dumb-witted in school. "Ash, come and sit here," Anthony commanded. The crowd parted. This was a rare honour, and Barney Toon grasped his newfound status eagerly, sitting himself right next to Anthony. The two thugs looked mildly surprised. "Was I talking to you?" Anthony practically spat out the word off. Barney Toon scuttled away and quickly submerged into the outer crowd again. Robbie was treated to a completely different reaction. An arm reached out to grab his shoulder in a rough but not unfriendly way. Billy Mills even stood up to make room for Robbie on the bench. "You've caught our attention, Ash," Anthony began. Billy seemed to snort from his position behind the bench. "You look pretty handy. Can you handle yourself?" "I'm not in your league." "Hear that, Bill? He's not in our league. But you're strong and fast. Tasty, yeah?" Robbie dreaded where this was going. Was he going to be asked to beat up some poor old pensioner who just happened to be passing by? He'd only ever thrown a couple of punches, nothing serious, and certainly nothing damaging. "I can handle myself in a corner." "Bet you can. Bet you can. Come out fist blazing, eh? Well-aimed headbutt, yeah?" "I've never headbutted anyone." "No? Joy in feeling a nose snap under your skull. One of the great pleasures in life, mate. Must try it sometime. Here are the girls. We can get started soon." Robbie was not entirely sure if he had a type when it came to women, but if he did, not one of the girls in front of him was his type. He preferred the shy, intelligent girls because they mirrored his own temperament, and hoped one day to navigate his way through adolescence with such a girlfriend at his side, at least for a while. However, Kelly, Anthony's girlfriend, who was walking towards them now, was different from the others. Certainly, she was excessively made up like the rest and smoked, constantly chewed gum, and generally tried to make herself look older. But it did not sit easily with Kelly, and Robbie sensed peer pressure had led her down a path with which she was not entirely comfortable. Robbie could only guess all this because he had walked Kelly home from a party last weekend. He'd not been trying it on with Kelly, and nothing had happened between them, but her abandonment by Anthony for some older female who had snogged half a dozen people that evening already had coincided with Robbie's own decision to leave when the 20-year-olds showed up with the brandy and the fighting dogs. Watching her walk up the road on her own at some time well past midnight, Robbie thought she looked so vulnerable and crushed that he offered to escort her the 4 miles back to her house. Over that walk, Kelly had opened up to him about her limited expectations in life. It was as if she did not dare to dream bigger. In his mind's eye, Robbie could see a lifetime of disappointment, possibly abuse ahead of her, all for trying to be popular now. "I don't know why I always pick 'em, Robbie. First Dean and now Anthony," she grumbled. "You seem like a nice guy and you're good looking. I don't know why—" "Am I?" "You know you are." "No, I don't, Kelly. I look in the mirror and I seem to be put together quite well, I guess. But the girls aren't queuing up at my door. I've never had a true girlfriend. Don't tell anyone, but I'm always astonished if a girl even notices me." Kelly laughed. "Where were you 4 months ago, Robbie? I should have gone out with you instead of—" Robbie smiled but did not know how to reply. "I know where he is, Anthony. I know he's with that older slapper. It's not the first time." She shook her head. "Oh, Robbie, shall you and I just keep walking and never look back and see where life leads us?" Taking his arm as they walked, she babbled on about her narrow dreams and hopes. Robbie noticed several cars pass them by, one even slowed down, but they could not see the people inside and none of the vehicles stopped. Outside her door had been an embarrassing, confusing, self-conscious moment where they both paused and stared at each other, their faces only inches apart. But the thought of death by boyfriend ran like a particularly violent film trailer in Robbie's mind, so he diffused the moment with a quick peck on the cheek. Then he turned his back on Kelly and headed home. That had been 6 days ago. "You mates with Robbie now?" asked Kelly, with something like concern and disappointment in her voice as she approached the stone shelter. "Nah, the opposites of mates." Anthony got up from the bench. Billy Mills's hands came down on Robbie's shoulders like heavy gavels, and Billy started to massage Robbie in the way a trainer does for a boxer in his corner between rounds. Robbie couldn't disguise the heaving of his chest now, as the others let out a roar of approval. The night's entertainment was about to start. Robbie was welcome to sit on the throne of kings if he was going to be their next victim. "You staring at my woman, Ash?" asked Anthony. There was no attempt to disguise the threat in his voice. "You better know she's mine." "I was only looking," Robbie replied, rising to his feet. Somehow an apology would be a sign of weakness. "She's fit, attractive. Take it as a compliment."
"I take it as a bloody insult, you scrote."
Anthony began to square up to Robbie. The others began to fall back. "Get cosy with her last Saturday, did ya? Do you know who the hell I am?" "I know who you are." Robbie swallowed down the public humiliation that almost had a taste. He avoided eye contact, dropped his head and tried to step away, only to collide with the solid oblong of Billy Mills. The bitter taste of humiliation was lost to the outright dread of fear. Robbie had no saliva. All his body's resources were being readied for the onslaught that was about to come. Robbie would not have admitted it, but he had never actually been in a true fight. Sure, there had been posturing, a few shoves, pushes, headlocks, a punch or two, but never the exchange of blows intended to really damage. Unlike the two people before him now, who went scrapping every weekend, Robbie would always be haunted by the consequences of his actions. Anthony and Billy only considered themselves to have had a good weekend after damaging some poor soul or other. Tonight it was to be Robbie's turn. He could not stand the fact that the others had formed an arena and some had their phones out ready to record the beating. Many were grinning and nodding. They were going to witness him being beaten up. Wasn't that enough? No way was he going to give them their wish to watch him beg or plead. The first punch caught him on the side of the head. It was harder than anything he'd ever felt before, but he was still standing. He did not try to make a fight of it, but instinctively hunched over, drawing his elbows into his stomach, head bowed, the side of his skull protected by clenched fists. He had no idea who was hitting him, but each blow felt shocking, and his only hope was to ride it out. How long would it take before they got bored? He found himself bowing before them, but he was still upright, still on his feet. Then they stopped, but it was over far too soon. Robbie looked up. Billy had taken out a knife, and away from the gaze of the security camera, Billy handed the weapon to Anthony. Kelly began to scream and launched herself at Anthony, but Billy held her back. Some of the other kids made a run for it, but Robbie knew he wouldn't get far in the state he was in. He knew they were not going to stab him. They would not risk a serious prison sentence for him, but they were probably going to cut him. He could guess that much. And there might be accidents. Buried deep in his mind, he felt gratitude. Firstly, that Kelly was still screaming and pleading with her boyfriend, and secondly, that at the very least, the twitches at the windows might call the police before things got out of hand. Keeping his back to the camera, Anthony swaggered towards Robbie.
"You thought we'd want to be mates with you, scrote. You try it on with my woman and you expect to be mates? Is that what you thought?"
Anthony was dipping his head this way and that to seek out Robbie's downturned gaze.
"It's Friday night, but school's still in, and you're here to learn a lesson, and we're here to make that handsome face of yours a little less handsome."
Some part of Robbie was no longer scared. Something calm, something inexplicable was inflating inside of him. He astonished himself, but as the knife inched towards him, Robbie was weighing up Anthony's weight and reach. Anthony was caressing Robbie's face with the blade, but as he went in to make an incision, Robbie found himself grabbing Anthony's wrist, surprising them both. In a swift, fluid, single movement, Robbie straightened and locked Anthony's arm at full extension, then delivered a forceful jab into Anthony's elbow joint from the outside. There was a disconcerting crack. Something thin, pale, and jagged was protruding through Anthony's arm. After a moment's silence, Anthony began screaming as he witnessed his own bones sticking out through the flesh. Even through the pain, Anthony tried to reach the knife with his other good hand. In all honesty, not even Robbie knew what he was doing now. His actions felt pre-programmed, automatic, and he was astonished to find himself lunging forward at his adversary. Grabbing the badly damaged arm by the wrist and the top of the shoulder, Robbie swung Anthony around in a pivot, driving his face into the brick wall of the sheltered seating. Anthony's body went limp, and he slid down the brickwork, twitching slightly. Even Robbie was horrified at what he'd just done. He was still trying to grasp how he had managed to respond to the threat of the knife. Part of Robbie wanted to scream, "Where have these moves come from?" He'd never really learned a martial art to any degree of proficiency or any sort of self-defense. Yet, it was as if his own muscles were remembering moves they had rehearsed 100 times before. There was total silence. The other friends now stared at Robbie with alarm. On some unspoken signal, most of them simultaneously began pelting away, Barney Toon amongst them. Although Billy Mills was gawping with astonishment, he had the presence of mind to let go of Kelly and advance on his adversary. Robbie gracefully and expertly nodded and bobbed his head out of the way of each punch, partly wondering why his feet refused to move or help in the fight. As Billy launched a huge punch at his opponent's face, Robbie drew back his head, the fist missing him by centimeters. Then he stepped forward and drove his own forehead into Billy's nose, sending the bigger boy sprawling onto the floor. There was no exultation in Robbie, just shock. He had just headbutted someone. How had he defeated the school head cases? He was winning the fight at the moment, but having his body act reflexively to moves his mind had no conscious knowledge of was equal to entrusting his life to a machine over which he had no control. Only a few of the group remained now, but they gazed at Robbie anew. Disgust was in Kelly's eyes. She was being dragged away by her friends and was shaking her head even as the tears came. "You're just like the rest of them. You blokes are all the same." Billy was still in a ridiculous seated position, like a toddler, who was bum flopped into a sandpit, blood oozing out of his mouth and nose.
"You're dead,"
he said, sounding faintly ridiculous through a mouth full of blood and snot. Then he picked himself up and staggered away, still determined not to run, as if running might be seen as a weakness. They had all abandoned Anthony. The security camera was making little motorized adjustments as Robbie paced back and forth. Up in the flats, he could see people on balconies, others on phones, and the light from the lampposts was spotlighting him wonderfully. The other kids might flee, but Robbie would not leave Anthony alone. Pulling Anthony into a remembered recovery position, Robbie removed the blood and gore from the boy's mouth to clear his airway and tried to adjust the shattered arm into a more comfortable position. Even then, Anthony sounded as if he was snoring. Then, Robbie waited for the distant sirens to arrive. No one came to offer assistance. Robbie could not help wondering, but if he had been stabbed, would everyone else have fled and left him for the police to clear up? He seemed to sit calmly, occasionally checking to see if there was any change in Anthony's condition. "Please let him live. Please, don't let him have any permanent damage," Robbie prayed to the starlit sky, to whatever might be listening. Torchlights were slicing up the night a little distance away. As Robbie tried to focus on how he had fought the boys, he found that, bizarrely, those very thoughts faded. It was as if the whole incident had happened to someone else. He had no idea how he had shown such intimidating force against such seasoned scrappers like Anthony and Billy. By the time the police arrived, Robbie looked like a teenager in trauma. He explained who he was and who Anthony was, although the police knew Anthony all too well already. As the police led him away, the bruises the boys had given him ached badly, but there was a chill inside Robbie that had little to do with him just wearing jeans and a t-shirt. Chapter 2. Cruel to Be.
Have a look through the CCTV footage, Robert, as well as the mobile phone recordings some of your friends were taking.
They're not my friends, Robbie interrupted. Constable Mitchell dipped his head in a point-taken sort of way.
No, well, there were also witnesses whose testimony seems to support your version of events, Robert, as does all video footage insofar as you clearly did not start the fight.
How is he, Anthony? Asked Robbie. Normally these interruptions would have irritated Constable Mitchell, but Robert Ash was not behaving with the normal, leery insolence of an Anthony Cairns Nash associate, and, anyway, this was not a formal interview. As far as Constable Mitchell could tell, Robert had answered all of his questions honestly. His statement tallied perfectly with the video footage he had already seen, and, other than having to ask a couple of questions to clarify details, Constable Mitchell found Robert Ash to be dealing with him fairly and courteously. This attitude in itself reassured Constable Mitchell that Robert Ash was new to the game and a first-time offender.
He has a compound for open fracture of his right arm, a traumatic deviated septum as well as a nasal fracture. His right orbit or eye socket had been damaged.
Will he still be able to see?
I haven't damaged his eyesight, have I? They're monitoring him, Robert, but for the moment his eyesight it seems fine. Anthony did come around, which enabled the medical staff to conduct some tests, and the initial results seem positive, but he is sedated now.
Constable Mitchell observed the way the boy in front of him drank in all the details about Anthony Cairns Nash's injuries like a thirsty refugee. Robert Ash was not regarding each wound as a triumphant trophy to enhance his bad boy reputation. There was genuine concern behind his inquiries.
Obviously, the hospital will want to keep monitoring him for several days. Standard procedure for a traumatic head injury, especially when the patient loses consciousness, but everything seems promising for the time being.
Robbie nodded, his breathing resembling someone psyching themselves up for a deep underwater dive. Bravado was all very well in front of your peers and thugs, but Robbie knew it would do him little good in front of the wily copper before him now. Have I done any lasting damage to him? Will he be all right?
Anthony won't be using his right arm again anytime soon, and his nose isn't looking pretty, and he might need some dental work, but it is positive for the moment, although with head trauma...
Constable Mitchell raised his shoulders and bounced his head from one side to the other. You never can tell straight away. Robbie was almost inaudible as he finished the sentence for the policeman.
I have to ask, Robert, are you a member of any boxing or martial arts clubs?
No.
Have you had any boxing or martial arts lessons in the past?
I had 10 weeks of karate lessons in Oxenfold Village Hall when I was 9, Robbie replied. But I can't remember any of it now. Constable Mitchell shook his head.
I doubt 10 weeks of karate lessons could have made such an impact.
Up until now, Robbie had answered all questions honestly and believed he was doing so now too. However, there was something in the back of his mind, some element that persisted to reside in the hazy, peripheral vision and refused to be scrutinized. These combat skills came from that place, which remained hidden away even from himself. The police officer gave him a searching, askance look.
It's just that I've looked at the CCTV and mobile phone footage some of your friends were taking.
They're not my friends.
No, sorry. But the way you defended yourself, well, it wasn't balanced, but it looked professional, like you had reacted in a similar fashion many times before.
The questioning way the policeman phrased the statement was almost a compliment.
Now, our records tell us that you've not been in trouble previously, so I can only assume this is a first offence.
It is. I haven't been in trouble with the police before.
It's very unlikely Anthony Cairns Nash will press charges, but that might not stop his family from taking matters into their own hands, Robert, explained the policeman. Now, we will do everything to stop that happening, but a word of caution. If that's how you react instinctively to a threat, get yourself some disciplined training in boxing or a martial art or you'll kill someone. Understood?
Robbie nodded.
Your mother is on her way now. explained Constable Mitchell. Just sit tight in the waiting area, and once the nurses have finished cleaning you up, you'll be free to go home tonight with your mother. Take care, Robert.
To emphasise that this was not just a throwaway goodbye, Constable Mitchell repeated himself more earnestly.
Seriously, Robert. Take care.
Due to his injuries being largely superficial and it being a Friday night, harvest time of a grim sort of crop for casualty staff, Robbie was assessed and was left in the accident and emergency waiting room with medical wipes whilst the staff dealt with more pressing cases. A few minutes later, Robbie peered through the window outside to see his mother in a heated argument with his grandmother. Although he could not hear the argument, all the heat and movement seemed to come from his mother, Eleanor, while his grandma, Gwen, stood still and passive, her hands in the pockets of her long, dark coat, watching her daughter pace and gesticulate around her. Robbie could guess he was the cause of the argument, although almost certainly Gabriel Sage would creep into the row too. Robbie was used to it. The relationship between his mother and grandmother, fractious at the best of times and often conducted at the extreme ends of the decibel range on his mother's side. Hydrogen, pilfer, conflict, cuckoo. Suddenly this sequence of words resounded through Robbie's head and repeated again like a religious chant. They made no sense, and Robbie had the feeling they were incomplete, but they felt important. Hydrogen, pilfer, conflict, cuckoo. The first person to greet Robbie was Ivor Noon. Due to his head being at a lower point of view than most, Ivor made one quick craning sweep of the accident and emergency room, then coasted up beside Robbie and hugged him. For as long as Robbie could remember, he had regarded Ivor Noon as someone who occupied a hazy territory between close uncle and best friend. A handsome man with an athletic torso and strong, muscular arms, Ivor never allowed the absence of working legs to hinder him from tackling anything. "How did you and Grandma get here so quickly?" asked Robbie.
"Oh, we were in the neighbourhood, more or less," Ivor replied vaguely as he applied the brakes to his wheelchair. "Want to talk about what happened?"
"It was just a fight with the guys from school," Robbie replied reluctantly.
"From what I hear, you did some serious damage, Rob."
"I'm not being evasive, Ivor. I genuinely don't know how I did it. I didn't mean to do it."
"I believe you. Want to talk about it?"
Robbie was not aware that he had wanted to talk about it, but suddenly the whole evening gushed out of his mouth. The walk to the park, the fake friendship offered by Anthony, the girls arriving, the turning against him. "And I'm getting hammered, Ivor. These guys are coming to town on me and I do nothing, just cower in fear and pain. Hope they're not going to damage me too badly, and it's..." But then he's got that knife in his hand and he's going to cut me, I know it. He wasn't going to stab me, but... And suddenly I feel this calmness spreading through me like a hot chocolate in a freezing winter's day. I know that sounds ridiculous. But next thing, I've shattered his arm and I'm just as horrified as he is, but he reaches for the knife again and suddenly I'm swinging him face first into a wall. Robbie shuddered involuntarily. Then the other one wades in and I'm dodging punches like a pro boxer and I floor him with a headbutt. I've never headbutted anyone. Never done anything like that before. Ivor nodded. Maybe it was the knife that set off some defense mechanism within you. Maybe. I don't know. Robbie was grateful he was taking his preposterous version of events so seriously. All I know is that I almost killed someone tonight.
You didn't kill him, Rob. I know head injuries are tricksy things, but rest assured you won't have killed him.
Ivor replied in a tone that somehow did not sound dismissive.
From what I gather, Anthony Cairns Nash is a scrapper. You'll recover. Now don't beat yourself up about... Oh, sorry. I might have phrased that better. Just remember you sometimes have to be cruel to be.
Robbie could not understand why Ivor seemed to be giving him permission to hospitalise another boy.
No offence, Ivor, but what would you know about it?
Ivor did not have an opportunity to reply, though, as at that moment there was a commotion from the door. Robbie stood up, having expected this might happen. He did not expect Ivor to almost run over his toes as he jerked his wheelchair in front of Robbie, though. A group of 4 people stormed into accident and emergency. 2 women and 2 males, one of them being Billy Mills, who was already sporting a couple of black eyes. He looked like an ugly panda who had really let himself go. The 3 other creatures around Billy looked the very definition of rough and ready.
"That one,"
said Billy, pointing to Robbie.
"The scrope behind the crib in the wheelchair."
Get him, Terry,
screeched the older woman, her 30-a-day voice like grated granite.
Remember what he done to our auntie?
Robbie guessed the man striding towards him, fists on the end of his thick forearms like chunky exclamation marks, to be Anthony's older brother. He had the same height and hairstyle, the opposite of a monk's, closely shaven around the sides with a sprouting growth on top like a hideous root vegetable. However, whereas Anthony was lanky, Terry Cairns-Nash had developed more muscle on his limbs. The hospital staff did what they could, but the security guard was barged to the floor and nurses were tugged back by the Cairns-Nash women who were screeching like banshees.
Get him, Tell!
If it was the knife that unlocked his instinctive fighting skills, Robbie knew he was in serious trouble. Terry Cairns-Nash had no need of a knife. But just as Anthony's older brother stepped past the wheelchair, Ivor jolted it forward, causing Terry Cairns-Nash to stumble. One arm grabbing the sides of the wheelchair to stop himself falling, Terry Cairns-Nash suddenly found strong fingers finding specific places on his throat and behind his ear. Rage quickly mutated to alarm in Terry's eyes, as he remained hunched over, paralysed by Ivor Noon.
Get off him!
Screamed Granite Voice. Completely unfazed by the threat, Ivor held up a splayed, open hand towards the hospital staff to indicate the dual message that he did not intend to cause trouble and that they should let things play out. "You haven't got time to be here, Terry. The police will be on their way and I bet they'd love to look at the contents of your nan's spare room. Who knew an old lady would be so into her electronics, eh?" Ivor was broadcasting to the entire accident and emergency so the Cairns-Nash women could hear as well. "And I'm sure John Parry might be fascinated by the contents of your lockup in Singleton Road." The comment even stopped Grated Granite Voice mid-screech. Paralysed, Terry Cairns-Nash cast a sideways glance at Ivor, confused alarm quickly being replaced by panic in his eyes. "I've had dealings with John Parry and he won't be pleased with you skimming a share off his take," Ivor continued. "Now, let me explain the food chain to you. You think you're big people in this little backwater, but in the grand scheme of things, you're nothing. You're bare bait." Ivor then whispered something in the brother's ear before launching Terry Cairns-Nash backwards with such power that the thug was left sprawling on the floor and Ivor's wheelchair rocked back on its wheels.
No one speaks to us like that. Do you know who we are?
Granite Voice's outrage seemed to burble through her lungs.
Go on, Tell. Eat the cripple too. Shut your mouth, woman.
Terry Cairns-Nash yelled at his mother. His voice was not as deep as hers, and he was actually cowering away from Ivor. "It's all right." Ivor Noon pacified the police officers who were just rushing through the doors with the expectation of another violent Cairns-Nash encounter. "There's no problem here." Ivor addressed the Cairns-Nash family again. "Your spawn had it coming. And if you give Robbie here one sniff of trouble, I'll devour you so quickly that John Parry will seem like the Salvation Army compared to me." Robbie always knew that Ivor worked out and compensated for his lack of legs with incredibly strong upper body strength. But he was astonished that a man in a wheelchair could intimidate a hardcore thug like Anthony's brother. But Terry Cairns-Nash was a beaten man who knew that his family's local reputation was not going to recover from this. "Like I said, Rob," Ivor said, no longer broadcasting, "sometimes you have to be cruel to be." Before Robbie could express his astonishment into coherent questions or words, his mother and grandmother strode into accident and emergency as if their row outside had never happened. Robbie could not help but be disappointed that his mother's immediate response was not to come to see him, but to speak to Constable Mitchell first. However, Grandma Gwen lost no time in heading straight towards Robbie and Ivor. Granted, accident and emergency on a Friday night was no catwalk, with people bleeding over their best evening wear, but Gwen Carroll stood out from those around her with her simple, made-to-measure slate-grey dress and long dark overcoat. As always, at her throat, Gwen Carroll sported the simple choker necklace of a black faceted tektite stone set within silver filigree, a matching bracelet on her right wrist. Even with her age, Robbie knew his grandmother was an elegant, classy woman who was unruffled by anything, including a roasting from her daughter. Hydrogen, pilfer, conflict, cuckoo. Without a trigger, the words echoed throughout Robbie's head again. Grandma Gwen hugged Robbie warmly. "Hello, sweetie. You been in the wars?" "It's hard to explain, Grandma." "You don't have to," answered Gwen Carroll, gently touching one of the bruises on his cheek. "The roughed-up look suits you, Robbie. You look both handsome and a little roguish. You'll soon be in a different combat, fighting off the women." Robbie smiled. He adored his grandmother for the fact that even though she was a widow, she could always look at life through a more positive filter. "It's good to see you. Thanks for coming, Grandma. I'll always be there for you, Rob, you know that." And suddenly, Eleanor Ash took over. It was clear that the two women were closely related, with refined beauty and an instinctive elegance. But whereas Grandma Gwen carried herself with the serene composure of an old-fashioned movie star, Eleanor seemed flustered by life, and being in the early stages of pregnancy had only exacerbated this. She was also noticeably blanking her own mother now. "Oh, Robbie, how did this happen?" Ellie began once she had kissed her son. "No, I don't want to know. The policeman said you didn't start it, I know. But you put a boy in hospital, Robbie." "I know, I didn't mean to, Mum, but—" "Well, this decides it then, Robbie," Ellie Ash declared. "I thought you might have settled here, but I can't risk you getting into any more fights and getting a criminal conviction. We leave for Gabriel's as soon as possible." Robbie had no affection for his stepfather, Gabriel Sage, but he clearly had no friends in this town either. For once, he was glad to leave the past behind him and move on. Chapter 3. The Museum of Phantasmagoria. After a long journey with 2 changes, the 3-carriage parliamentary train eventually clanked away from chuffing Sodmore's lonely station, leaving Robbie and his mother on the short, wind-blown platform. There was no sign of Gabriel Sage to meet them, only a man near retirement dressed in a grubby uniform. "Excuse me," asked Eleanor Ash to the only other figure on the platform. "Do you know if anyone has been waiting here for us?" "Ain't seen a soul," replied the shambling old station master. "Are you sure?" "No one." "Not a tall man with a fabulous moustache," she continued. "No one waiting here at all." "Oh, waiting for you. Why didn't you say?" The station master stopped and tugged a strand of the little that was left of his hair in a salute. "Well, the marching band had to leave for another booking, and I couldn't organise the parade in time. I'm sure the local bigwigs will be gutted." "I'll take that as a no," said Ellie Ash, deciding not to rise to the sarcasm. She turned to Robbie. "Gabriel must be expecting us on another train. We'll wait." "Then you'll be waiting a fair while," the station master called out as he shuffled back towards the warmth of his tiny office. "Next train's not until 7 this evening, and that's the postal train bound for Bristol. Don't so much stop as slow down some. Anyone waiting for 'em? Who do they think they are?
Royalty? I ask you.
He closed the door to his dingy office, forsaking mother and son to the elements. Robbie guessed that a woman bearing an unborn baby, even in the very early stages of pregnancy, was carrying enough weight already, and so he heaved as many of the suitcases as he was able out of the station. But no Gabriel Sage in his immaculate old Jaguar car awaited them there either. 5 minutes later, Ellie asked her son, "We are doing the right thing, aren't we, Robbie? I want to know I'm doing the right thing by you and with you. I love you more than I love Gabriel. Tell me we're doing the right thing, moving all the way out here." Robbie was silent for a moment. "What if I said no, Mum?" "Well, I don't know what we'd do. Are you saying no? You're not saying no, are you?" "No, Mum, I'm not saying no. We're doing the best thing for us." Ellie Ash smiled at Robbie and headed for the toilet. Robbie glanced down at the suitcase by his feet and wondered how he had managed to pack his 15 years of life into one medium-sized bag. To be fair, he had chosen to leave most of his things back at Grandma Gwen's house in the hope that his mother might change her mind and decide they should return there instead. The alternative to this instead was living with Gabriel Sage, his mother's fiancé, father to the unborn baby, and Robbie's soon-to-be stepfather. But Robbie had plenty of time to experience Gabriel Sage soon. He did not want to think about him now. "He must have got caught up with work on the museum," explained Ellie Ash as she returned from the toilet. "Gabriel will be here soon." They waited for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, half an hour, but Gabriel Sage did not arrive. The sky sank lower, with the clouds beginning to bulge and blur with water. Ellie Ash tried phoning her fiancé, but there was no answer, and it was a very poor signal anyway. Chuffing Sodmore was a popular place with the tourists in summer, but there were no waiting taxis and certainly no horse-drawn carts into the village come late September. Steeling themselves against the weather, Robbie and his mother began to trudge along the country lanes for the 2 miles it would take them to get to the museum. Half a mile into their walk, they put down their cases to rest their limbs and get some feeling back into their fingers. Almost immediately, the wind ripping across the moor died down a little, although Robbie was amazed how well the thin new coat Grandma had given him protected its wearer from the elements. A mile into their trudge, on top of the exposed rise leading down into the village, it began to rain. 1¼ miles into their sodden misery, a passing farmer took pity of them and gave Robbie and his mother a lift in his trailer, covered with plastic sheeting. "Where've you two come from, then?" he asked over the rattle of the tractor. "Bristol, originally," explained Ellie Ash, exhaustion causing her to abandon speaking in sentences. "Train station. Here." "So where are you two headed, then?" the farmer continued, after eventually managing to crunch the tractor into gear. "Chuffing Sodmore's Museum of Phantasmagoria," replied Ellie. "Never heard of it." "Up by the Phillips house?" she said. "Oh, aye, the one run by the weird colourful idiot," said the farmer. "Old Nick, the builder, says that Sage fellow has taken the old church and a perfectly nice couple of cottages and turned them into a place of unnatural sights. What do you want up there?" "That Sagefield is to be my husband." The farmer stared at Ellie Ash for a moment to check if she was joking. Then he nodded, pulled the plastic sheeting back down, and crunched the tractor into a higher gear. A short, damp, deafening ride later, and the farmer's tractor delivered Robbie and his mother outside Chuffing Sodmore's new Museum of Phantasmagoria. The 2 long cottages and attached church of the museum formed one side of the perimeter of a cobbled square. Opposite these were a terraced row of cottages, along with a pub called the Bog Diggers Arms, and at the end of the road stood the famous Phillips house, with the road down into the rest of the village in the place where the 4th side would have been. In the centre of the square was a plinth, and stood upon it was a statue of a soldier carrying a rifle and bayonet, a monument to all the men in the village who had fallen in battle during the 2 world wars. Hunched at the feet of the soldier, her chin resting on her knees and her arms wrapped around her legs, sat a girl of Robbie's own age with light brown hair and dark brown eyes. She appeared to be staring at him, so Robbie smiled and nodded. Nothing. Perhaps she had not seen the nod, Robbie thought. He smiled again and raised a hand in greeting. Still no reaction.
Eleanor, what do you mean by turning up here on agricultural machinery? Asked Gabriel Sage in a hushed, resentful undertone as he dashed up to greet them. It gives quite the wrong impression. We're not a bunch of vagabonds. Never mind, I'll let it slip just this once, but see that it doesn't happen again, really.
He gave the soaked mother of his unborn child a peck on the cheek without really touching her at the risk of getting his own immaculate clothes damp. Then he ruffled Robbie's hair. Picking up the smallest suitcase, Gabriel Sage led them towards the cottages. A gangly man with an energetic stride, a rakish haircut, and an outrageous moustache that tapered into delicate curlicues some distance beyond the edges of his cheeks. Robbie always thought that Gabriel Sage looked like a young man trapped in the look of an older individual. He seemed to belong to another time, a feeling only reinforced by his wardrobe, which was always some tweed or checked suit, a colourful waistcoat, and a bow tie. As Robbie followed his mother and soon-to-be stepfather into the cottages, he became aware that the workmen cast down their eyes and shied away from getting too close to Gabriel Sage. Only after he passed would they stare after him, as if in fear of a tyrant. An elderly carpenter noticed Robbie staring at the rest of the workmen.
Your father?"
he asked, jabbing at the door through which Gabriel Sage had just passed. Stepfather. Well, nearly, replied Robbie with a sigh. The carpenter nodded.
You're not keen on him?
Robbie grimaced.
Feel sorry for your nipper.
The carpenter grimaced back.
He's one sick soul.
As Robbie strode into the cottage, he cast one last look back for the silent brown-eyed girl on the war memorial, but she was nowhere to be seen. The thick stone walls of the cottages might once have lent an air of cosy authenticity to the buildings, but now they provided a feeling of medieval imprisonment. Although it was supposed to be a celebration of the art of taxidermy, the Museum of Phantasmagoria did not deserve to exist in any place in the world at any time in the history of mankind. The museum simply had no right to belong anywhere. Small square windows hardly illuminated the room at all, allowing the glow from the display cases to draw the eyes instantly. Within each exhibit was a macabre scene of dead animals depicting some event in history or an episode in literature or legend. The first display case Robbie passed showed a magnificent dead hare wielding a sword. The animal posed as if about to slice through a complex tangle of rope, while the stuffed rabbits surrounding it stared on in awe and wonder. A sign beneath the exhibit read, "Alexander the Great solves the riddle of the Gordian knot." The scene would have been embarrassing were it not for the attention to detail in the exhibit that was obsessive to the point of insane genius. The hare was dressed in leather armor molded to the muscles of a man's torso, his regal cloak embroidered with gold trim, and the sword, emblazoned with classical markings, possessed notches in its blade as if to signal genuine battle experience. Even the rabbits were authentically equipped as ancient soldiers, holding spears and wearing dented helmets, as well as worn sandals that looked as if they had trekked across the dust of an entire continent. Other than their costumes and weapons, they were a hare and rabbits, except that Gabriel Sage had stitched in eyebrows to increase the range of expressions of the dead animals. To Robbie's mind, this only made them look more unsettling and eerie. The next case contained the backdrop of the battlements of a castle and, in the foreground, a badger with wild, manic eyes glaring out through the glass in an accusatory manner. 3 crows stood at his back, appearing to whisper into his ears. A label beneath the case read, "Macbeth meets with the Weird Sisters." When Robbie pressed the button beside the label, a harsh white flash lit up the scene for an instant, followed by a rumble of distant thunder. Then the badger's lower jaw began to move up and down as a deep voice sounded, "It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing." Case after case of similar scenes lined the walls of the museum. Many had buttons to make the stuffed animals enact basic movements, but these often bordered somewhere between the absurd and the alarming. The centre of this room of scenes, spawned from the mind of Gabriel Sage, was reserved for huge cases containing extraordinary set pieces. A couple of them empty, but the largest was entitled The Battle of the Somme, 1st July 1916. Hedgehogs, songbirds and rabbits were huddled in a trench, about to storm up ladders to the bomb-pitted landscape above. They were brandishing rifles, and all seemed to possess a look of steely determination mixed with fear. It was both amazing and disturbing how Gabriel Sage had made these animals look so human. On the far side of the exhibit were rats, squirrels, stoats and ferrets dressed in old German army uniforms, manning their rifles and machine gun nests in the many shell craters. Across the centre of the display, between the two sides, was a vast no-man's land. The immense scale was achieved by employing clever forced perspective, using progressively smaller animals, so the bodies of rabbits were replaced by mice and songbirds, by sparrows and wrens, and then all of them by insects. Every one of them dressed as soldiers who had died in combat. The effect was like looking over an enormous field of utter carnage, with bodies littering the landscape for miles. Robbie was coming to believe that Gabriel Sage possessed brilliance in a talent for which no one could ever possibly have any use. "Well, what are your thoughts, Eleanor?" asked Gabriel Sage, carefully scrutinizing his future wife's expressions as she wandered around the museum, her body racked with shivering. "Maybe I'm coming down with something, Gabe, but it's just not what I was expecting." Gabriel Sage stared back with icy severity. "But I do feel ill, darling," Ellie Ash added. "Well, you'd better go to bed then, darling. I believe you're suffering from a severe case of ingratitude, and I would not want to expose you to any more disappointment over all of the months of hard work I have put into this place for us. Robert, your room is in that direction. Don't you dare go snooping around my workshop at the other end. Both my workshop and the church are out of bounds. Hear me?" But Gabriel Sage had disappeared behind plastic sheeting that led into the church before anyone could answer, leaving his fiancée with the heaviest luggage. Ellie Ash did indeed look ill and had taken on the appearance of a sweaty marble statue. Robbie helped his mother upstairs, fetching towels to dry her, and made sure she got into bed to rest. After toweling off the droplets of rain from her face, he noticed that beads of sweat quickly replaced them. Robbie placed a hand on his mother's forehead and found her blood temperature to be very hot. "Yes, Robbie, I know how it seemed, but Gabe was right. Was right. Yes. She began with a speech induced by delirium. "I should have supported him. Unforgivable for me to doubt him, especially in front of the workmen. How can he forgive me?" "Rest now, Mum. You're making no sense," soothed Robbie. "You must try to be friends with Gabriel. You will try to be friends with him, won't you? I know you don't understand how I can be with him, but when someone comes along who is gentle with you, inspires you, little kindnesses." "What little kindnesses has he ever shown you, Mum?" "Little kindnesses, yes. Have I failed you, Robbie? No, Mum. What would your father say? How dare he leave? How dare he? She caught a couple of sobs, plugging the dam before it burst. You are my best friend, my family, Robbie. I love you, but Gabriel is our future now. Robbie could bite his lip no longer. I can forgive him for being short with us, Mum. I cannot forgive him for failing to pick you up at the station and leaving you in this condition. You're carrying his baby. A lot on his mind, Robbie. Not like other men. He has a vision we cannot grasp. A visionary, yes, a visionary, murmured Ash as she slipped into sleep. There were many labels Robbie might have given his stepfather, but visionary was far from being the first that sprung to mind. Gabriel Sage was nowhere to be found, so Robbie returned downstairs to look in on his own room. It was as he expected. A dingy place with a tiny window, a rickety old camp bed, a tea chest for a bedside table, and a lamp without a lampshade. The room could not have made less of an effort to be welcoming if it had tried. Robbie sighed, grateful at least to have a door between him and the nightmares in the glass cases outside. Robbie was ignored throughout most of the rest of the day. The builders felt sorry for him, but they were too busy caught up with their own work to offer anything more than a smile or an occasional friendly word. But Robbie did not want anyone's sympathy. In a brief let-up of the rain, he took a turn around the square and read the tourist information plaque set up outside the Phillips Garden. The great 19th century writer Celeste Phillips and her artist brother, Willard, were two of the founders of the mid-Victorian immaterial movement. That was enough for Robbie. He turned away from the house and perched on the edge of the war memorial. It seemed to him that the statue of the soldier gazed forlornly down the hill to the main part of the village below, as if longing to join its ranks of life once more, but Chuffing Sodmore seemed pretty lifeless as far as Robbie could tell. Turning his lethargic gaze on the Museum of Phantasmagoria, not for the first time, Robbie wondered how his life had led him here. Gabriel Sage had come into their lives a little over a year and a half ago. He had quickly worked out that Robbie's mother was fairly wealthy, as well as being a widow, and had wooed and won her. Now they were moving to a place of his choosing, funded with her money to have their child. What did Mum see in the man? Robbie asked himself at least once a week. So caught up was Robbie in his thoughts that he did not notice that the girl with the light brown hair and the dark brown eyes was stood only feet away, staring at him. Robbie tried to smile and nod again. All right. The girl looked through him as if she could eradicate him with that fierce stare. Nothing was said for several moments. Her voice, when it came, was a quiet threat. You're in my place. Robbie sighed, but got up off the plinth and let her sit down. The girl did not move. She nodded her head towards the cottages of the Museum of Phantasmagoria. You're in my place, she repeated. Oh, did you used to live there? He asked. But the girl seemed to be bored of him already. Without another word, she turned on her heel and strode away down the hill towards the village. Nice to make new friends, Robbie said aloud to himself. It was not long before the next flurry of rain drove Robbie back inside the Museum of Phantasmagoria and to his room, where he began to read. Ash remained in bed with a temperature for the rest of the day. When Robbie went to check on his mother later, it was with a sense of relief and surprise that he found his stepfather tenderly nursing his future wife, spoon-feeding her soup. You'll be pleased to hear that Gabe and I are friends again, Robbie, said his mother in a breathless voice. She was still shattered. We're of the mind that it would be best if you both spent some more time together. She paused to catch her breath once more. Gabe needs some assistance with the displays. I've said you would be willing to help. It's all our futures. I think it would be an excellent idea if we all met each other halfway. So, no lessons today. Listen to your father and do as he says.
Robbie flinched at the word father, but managed to restrain himself from a resentful outburst. He glanced at Gabriel Sage, who stared back with a blank expression that was impossible to fathom. Robbie backed away and retreated to his hovel of a bedroom. Sleep, when it came, felt like an escape route. He did not fight it. Chapter 4. Casualties. Maybe it was the thought that he was spending the rest of his teenage years with Gabriel Sage that took its toll on Robbie, but some sort of mental fatigue meant that he did not rise until the middle of the morning the next day. Sitting up in the creaking camp bed, he wondered why his stomach hurt so much, and then remembered that he had hardly eaten the day before. As he sat rubbing his belly, Robbie pondered over his situation and realized, not for the first time in his 15 years of life, that he was alone and isolated, with only his mother for company. Isla Ash had been traipsing around the country with her son for years now, having decided to largely home-educate Robbie and occasionally others, rather than risk becoming established anywhere. It was as if she was deliberately exiling herself from Bristol, as well as from Grandma Gwen and Robbie's best friend Ivan Noon. Mother and son would sometimes return to Bristol, as they had done for the last few weeks, and these had been some of the happiest times in Robbie's life, but it was never long before Isla Ash was itching to move on. Only this time, it was permanent. Robbie knew that his mother loved him and that she was providing him with sound learning, but also knew that theirs was not a typical existence. He had made the odd friend or two amongst the other home-educated children, but every time they relocated, distance combined with time would erode away the friendships he had formed until he came to rely almost entirely on the company of his mother, grandmother, and Ivan Noon. Robbie had barely begun to ponder his history when Gabriel Sage marched into the room. "You have 5 minutes, Robert," he declared, retrieving a grimy shovel and trowel from beneath the camp bed. 5 minutes to be outside and in the car. You and I are going on a hunt today. I want to gauge how useful you might be to me." Robbie hardly registered a word. He was staring at the garments of his soon-to-be stepfather, who had donned an all-in-one blue working overall over his predictable combination of shirt, bow-tie, waistcoat, and jacket. The outfit was accessorized with a pair of yellow washing-up gloves that echoed the mustard color of the peeping waistcoat. "Robert, what did I just say?" "Outside, in the Jag. 5 minutes." "Correct. Why are you clutching your stomach?" asked Sage. "It's nothing," replied Robbie. "Good. I'm not carting some cripple around the countryside. There'll be no passengers on my ventures, young man. You'll pay your way here." Gabriel Sage about-faced and bowled out of the room. 4.5 minutes. Robbie got dressed in the fine quality clothes his grandmother had given him before they left Bristol, and then he pounded upstairs to check on his mother. She was sleeping peacefully, but her temperature was still high, even though a cool, damp flannel had been placed on her forehead. A small handbell stood on a bedside table, but Robbie wondered whom it was supposed to alert if both he and Gabriel Sage were out all day. Descending the stairs, Robbie found a large kitchen towards the back of the property. Breakfast was out of the question, though, due to the room reeking of something like pungent medicine, and the revelation that the contents of the fridge consisted almost entirely of the bodies of small mammals and birds, with the freezer section full of insects. There was a sharp toot on a car horn. Robbie sighed and shuffled back into the museum. Inside, the builders were hard at work, but it was clear that all of them kept a wary eye on the exhibits. Robbie stopped the carpenter he had briefly spoken to on the previous day. "Excuse me,
I'm sorry to do this to you, but my mother's ill upstairs. If you hear a bell ringing, would you see what she wants?
Sorry, Nipper, but we're behind as it is, and that your stepfather will have me stuffed and mounted and added to this flaming museum if he thinks we've dropped the pace even a mite. He can be a right old...
There was a second, prolonged blast of a car horn.
But I don't need to tell you that.
Please, I'll have to go with him, Robbie pleaded. Several other builders had stopped their work and cast sympathetic looks at Robbie. Please?
I ain't doing any nursing, but I'll make sure your ma wants for nothing.
Thank you. Thank you. Robbie shook the man's hand, dashed out of the building, and clambered into the passenger seat of the growling vintage car.
7 minutes, Robert,
spat Gabriel Sage, wheels spinning the car out into the road before Robbie had even shut his door.
Never keep me waiting.
I had to check on Mum. Gabriel Sage chewed on his bottom lip for a moment.
I suppose such sentiment is to be expected. 3 minutes late, though. It won't do in the future.
The vintage Jaguar growled with latent power as it was steered towards the smaller byways over the moors.
Now, Robert, I know you and I have hardly been chums, but if you obey the rules I am about to set out for you, we shall muddle through. Firstly, you will never contradict anything I say. Truly, I do know best, and as far as you're concerned, my word is law. Secondly, you will do what I tell you, and when I tell you to do it. Also, you will never try to play your mother and myself against each other by running away to complain to her about me, or you will rue the day. I have no qualms with beating children if I believe they deserve it. I've waited a long time to make this endeavour a reality. I will have no one jeopardize it now, especially not some imbecilic teenager. Am I making myself crystal clear?
Robbie nodded. There had to be some charm, some appeal, some hidden element about this flamboyant, selfish character that did not rank him as obnoxious, Robbie reasoned, or why his mother would want to spend the rest of her life with him.
Now, keep your eyes peeled, Robert.
What are we on the lookout for?
Casualties.
There appeared to be no sense of destination to the car ride. The leaping silver cat on the bonnet led the way as they swept into little lanes, prowled along the main roads and then nosed into lanes again, as if trying to locate the scent of the quarry. On more than one occasion, Robbie found that they were travelling back along a road they had just taken, but in the opposite direction.
It hasn't been this barren for an age,
muttered Gabriel Sage after half an hour, as he sat hunched over the steering wheel.
Rabbits haven't started to migrate, have they? We should have spotted a mixie-riddled specimen at the very least.
Robbie was beginning to understand the purpose of bringing the shovels, the trowel, the tongs, as well as the plastic sheeting on the back seat, when his soon-to-be stepfather uttered,
"At last, a victim!"
The old Jaguar glided to a halt beside the body of a rabbit stretched out upon the grass verge. The animal appeared as if it might have been trying to top up its tan, but no amount of warmth could help this creature. Gabriel Sage leapt out of the car, bent down, sniffed the corpse, and began to study it intimately.
"Robert, pick up our patient with the utmost care. It is fresh, less than an hour dead, and hardly damaged. A real find."
Robbie ignored the shovel offered to him by Gabriel Sage, genuflected besides the dead rabbit, and tenderly raised it from the grass with his hands. A little stream of blood flowed down his hands and dripped onto the coat and boots his grandmother had given him just before he and his mother had left Bristol. The baptism of blood did not stain either the coat or his boots in the slightest, but ran off the material as water does on wax, to soak into the earth like a blessing or a sacrifice. Gabriel Sage seemed pleased with Robbie and quickly reached for a large shoebox lined with plastic sheeting. The rabbit was sealed inside, and carefully installed into the boot of the vintage car.
"Good, Robert. Nicely done," declared Gabriel Sage,
as the car trembled into life, then purred out into the road and they continued on their hunt for the dead.
"Executed with care and without a trace of pathetic squeamishness. Gratifying."
It was hardly a matter of Robbie being keen to pick up the corpses of animals, but he was not queasy about such things either. The lifeless rabbit brought to mind an incident he had shared with his friend Ivor Noon back in Bristol. The memory was of Ivor vaulting across the garden, the swinging and pitching of his muscular arms causing his trademark loping gait. Then he was beckoning Robbie to a robin that was dying from the attentions of a cat. Robbie did not like the sensations of holding a small, dying creature in his hands, but the little robin was beyond any show of resistance. The rapid heaving of its chest began to falter as its life waned. "What should we do?" Robbie had asked, anxiously.
"We should kill it," Ivor had replied. "It would be a mercy."
"I don't like to."
"It's not a case of liking to, Robbie," Ivor explained. "It's a case of necessity, duty even. It's in your hands."
They had not killed the robin, however, but Robbie had attributed many profound emotions to its tired gaze before it shuddered and closed its eyes on the world. Later, they found a large matchbox and buried the little bird where they had found it.
"Beyond value,"
Ivor had uttered in a respectful hush. To this day, Robbie did not know if his friend was talking about robins, the experience of watching the bird die, or life in general. The next creature Robbie and his soon-to-be stepfather came across was a hedgehog that had been squashed flat into the road, but, far from stopping to pick it up, Sage drove his car over the dead body of the hapless animal as if it had never existed. Clearly, his love of animals extended only to the quality and intactness of their frames and pelts.
"Every 24 hours there's a fresh crop, Robert, just waiting there for collection, and all for free, too. Death is my partner, my assistant, and my inspiration."
There appeared to be very few vehicles to encounter on the narrow moorland roads at this time of year, leaving Robbie wondering if the dead animals might not have been hit accidentally by traffic at all, but were voluntarily committing suicide instead. He had retrieved the bodies of 5 rabbits, 3 hedgehogs, 1 crow, and a fox by lunchtime, but even though his stomach ached, he felt far from hungry. Robbie was more worried about how his mother might be faring and was relieved when Gabriel Sage started to talk about bringing the day's hunt to an end.
"Well, the haul's not enormous, but not shabby either," said Gabriel Sage as they began to head for home. "If you continue to behave in this manner, Robert, we may even become quite chummy. Don't place your bloody hands on my seats."
"Good."
"As you may have gathered, the majority of my collection is brought together thus. Yet you will have noticed that some of the more exotic creatures on display in the museum are not native to these isles, and I doubt not you are wondering where I obtain such animals," Sage pronounced, smoothing down the centre of his moustache and not even glancing at the boy beside him. "Over years, I have forged good relations with several zoos and private collectors. People are only too keen for someone else to dispose of their dead, you see. I provide—" "Oh, yes, yes, yes! The gods are shining!"
Gabriel Sage appeared to go into a trance of ecstasy. The cause was a deer lying dead in front of a gate leading to a small copse. Robbie watched, transfixed, as the gangly figure pranced around the fallen doe, hardly able to contain himself, the washing-up gloves clasped against his chest as if in prayer. It took both of them all their strength to heave the hefty animal onto the plastic sheeting on the back seat of the car, where it reclined in a slovenly repose, its muzzle pressed up against the back window.
"You see, Robert,
Most people are too pedestrian, too feeble-minded in their ambitions, proclaimed Gabriel Sage from the driver's seat, glancing between Robbie and the road with a wide-eyed dementedness. My own mother and father were cursed with a terminal lack of aspirations and an unforgivable ability to try to stifle greatness in their son. Twisted, freakish I was called when I was younger, and not just by my family. Men and women are content to devour the flesh of animal, happy to guzzle down its various organs and muscle, wear their skins and pelts, yet somehow many seem unable to cope with my calling, my craft, to take these same animals and make them poetic, heroic, eternal, a unique legacy. The vintage car was brought to a sudden, skidding halt in the middle of the lane, causing the dead deer's nose to squeal down the back window. Gabriel Sage turned to Robbie and stared at him with an unblinking intensity, his voice in rapture. My notion, my whole endeavour is to create nothing short of a mythological heritage for this country. Maybe the world. The museum is but the opening salvo to my campaign. But I have such scope, such determination. He leaned in towards Robbie as if unwilling to let any concealed spies overhear his designs, yet desperate to share his secret with someone, anyone. Then he whispered, You see, I have begun to mix animals, produce hybrids. I can create the bodies of creatures from extinction, even legend and myth. I'll wager that few, if any, could prove many of my specimens to be fakes. I am that good. I could produce the evidence for a hidden history for everyone to believe in. What a legacy! They stared at each other with a shared expression for several moments. Then the jaguar roared back into life. Robbie had to stop himself from laughing. Even though the information was astonishing, it was hard to take seriously when delivered by a man dressed in a suit covered with blue overalls and wearing washing-up gloves. No promises, and this may be premature, but if you keep up this good behavior, I may even show you the secret of my talent.
Don't do me any favors, thought Robbie. I'm more than willing to wait.
Chapter 5. Lovecraft. Over the following fortnight, as his mother convalesced, Robbie was to be found scouring the moors with Gabriel Sage for carcasses of roadkill, or back in the museum gutting the catch. Robbie was still unclear what it was that drove Sage. It seemed to be about some future reserved for him alone. However, Robbie was coming to believe that his soon-to-be stepfather genuinely believed that his creatures and, as Sage saw it, their potential effects on history, science, even religions with their discovery, would certainly unleash people's imaginations so that they might look at everything around them with new eyes. Increasingly, Robbie became aware that on their hunts around the countryside, they were less concerned with picking up the bodies of larger victims and more focused on smaller animals. I know. It breaks my heart to abandon such a fine specimen, declared Gabriel Sage ruefully, as Robbie craned his head back to look at the body of a gull they had just passed. But the present display requires smaller exhibits, and until those damn slackers who pass for builders are out, space is at a premium in the museum. At night, after waiting to hear Gabriel Sage shuffle off to bed at the end of another evening spent secretly toiling in his workshop, that once was the vestry of the deconsecrated church that only he alone was allowed to enter, Robbie would leave the museum and wander about Chuffing Sodmore. It was less a matter of defiance than a need to occupy his mind from his captivity and boredom. Robbie would always start his expeditions into the village at the centre of the square with the soldier on the plinth. He felt such an affinity with this fixed, frozen individual that Robbie would confide all his thoughts and worries to the man of stone. Those evening treks might have become very dull if Robbie had not discovered something quite extraordinary about his new coat. Grandma Gwen had given him the garment, along with a pair of boots, on the very day Robbie and his mother had left Bristol for Chaffing Sodmore. If he were being honest, Robbie would have to say that the coat was not really his style. It reached down to his ankles, which was longer than he would have liked, but it was light, tough, and, most importantly, reminded him of Grandma. On his 4th night in his new home, when Gabriel Sage had unexpectedly gone to bed early, Robbie was sat on the plinth at the bottom of the statue. He was telling the soldier that the distant whistle of the postal train bound for Bristol was the sound of his own spirit heading north when the cold began to become painful. Robbie was reluctant to creep back to his room quite yet, so pulled up the hood of his coat and silently thanked his grandmother for the garment, which at least provided some sort of barrier from the elements. Folded within the inside pocket, he found a pair of thin but tough gloves made from the same material as his coat and quickly slipped them on. It was just as he was tucking the left-hand glove beneath the sleeve of the coat that Robbie happened to notice a rectangular label bearing the image of a stalking tiger indented within one of the cuffs. The thin plastic label turned out to be a cover for 3 discrete buttons beneath it. All 3 buttons were marked with an icon of the coat, but each one was a little different from the other. The image on the first button was the plain outline of the garment, but when Robbie pressed it, nothing happened. The second button was emblazoned with an image of the coat, but with wavy lines emanating from its surface, while the third traced its outline in broken lines. Robbie pressed the second button and, almost instantly, warmth flooded through the coat, gloves, and hood. It was as if the cloth possessed its own heating system. As soon as he pressed the third button, however, the warmth subsided to be replaced by an even more astonishing reaction. The coat, and everything it covered, appeared to vanish. It was not that the coat became entirely invisible, but that the fabric suddenly blurred and distorted the space it occupied to such a degree it was impossible to see a clear outline of the person beneath. If anyone had been watching very, very closely, it would have looked as if a boy's face was sat upon a shimmering body-shaped object formed from the village statue. Looking at himself in the shop window, Robbie felt as if he were made from the same stuff as ghosts. The effect was amazing, and for some minutes Robbie lost total track of time, watching the material mirror and warp the various surroundings when he moved. Robbie had never heard of such a discovery, but knew he had to exploit it. After some experimentation, he found that pulling down his hood and slightly crouching effectively rendered him almost entirely invisible, especially in low light levels. Gabriel Sage was keeping increasingly eccentric hours when it came to sleep. Often, he would work well into the early hours of the morning, then take to his bed for huge periods of time during the daylight hours. Robbie took such opportunities as invitations to get any of his chores done as swiftly as possible, then duck out of the Museum of Phantasmagoria to explore the village beyond. In the late afternoon of the day after he had discovered the invisibility function on his coat, Robbie just happened to glance out through a window of the museum. There she was again, the brown-eyed girl with a livid expression, rising up off her usual seat at the foot of the soldier statue to mooch her way down the hill to the main part of the village. She was the only person of his own age Robbie had encountered in Chaffing Sodmore, and he hoped she might lead him to others. Therefore, Making sure there were no witnesses, he switched his coat into its invisibility function and crept out of the museum to follow her. The day had decided to go into full autumn mode. Low clouds scooted along in different swells and swirls of grey, threatening rain. The sun was just a vague impression of light, bringing no warmth, and a chill wind whipped down the main street, although Robbie was glad his new coat did not billow up too much, threatening to reveal him. He kept to shadows and side roads to follow the girl, but he need not have worried about exposure, because the few people still out and about had their heads bowed against the gusts. At the far end of the village was a children's playground, looking out over the bleak moorland, where rusting swings twisted and convulsed in the wind, along with the paint-peeling roundabout which groaned and creaked with each new blast off the moors. It was here that the brown-eyed girl stopped and sat down on one of the swings, kicking off listlessly with her feet. A little time later, the twin toddlers squeaked and shuffled down the slide for the last time, and hand in hand tottered home with their frozen mother, leaving the brown-eyed girl with the playground to herself. She did not move, but remained on her swing, scuffing back and forth with no sense of energy or purpose. She did not even move when the gang of 4 mid-teens swaggered into the playground and, fanning out like predators on a hunt, stalked their way towards her. From his vantage point in the corner of the playground, Robbie could make out the 2 girls and 2 boys quite clearly. Having been shoved around from school to school so much since he was little, Robbie was an expert in recognizing types of teens, and these 4 were a cinch to categorize. The smug leader with the high-maintenance hair who thought he was smarter than he actually was. His sidekick clone who was surlier, squintier, and less intelligent. The tall, angular, spoilt girl with the upturned nose who was popular because she was so effortlessly good at everything. And her heavier best friend since nursery companion with the constantly downwards turned mouth, which always made her look like she was sneering, even when she was genuinely enjoying herself.
"Looks like you've managed to clear out the playground again," tall, spoilt girl began. "Everywhere you go, people seem to leave, don't they, Lovecraft?" "Why are you so popular, Lovecraft?" Turned Down Mouth launched in too.
"Now, ladies, we must be kind," declared high-maintenance hairboy, smirking as he interrupted. "Since Isla's been kicked out by the freaks in that museum, where are you living now?"
"Come back tomorrow?" Brown-eyed girl appeared unfazed by their taunts, barely even looking in their direction. "I'll try and care about what you think tomorrow." Robbie almost laughed, immediately warming to the brown-eyed girl. She was a loner, and she was fearless, even when outnumbered. What Robbie had also noticed, though, was that high-maintenance hairboy stole glances at that brown-eyed girl they called Lovecraft, as if drinking in as much of her as possible. Peer pressure and saving face would deny him ever pursuing it. Almost certainly he was going out with tall, spoiled girl, but Robbie would have bet that high-maintenance hairboy secretly fancied Lovecraft. Robbie watched with amusement as high-maintenance hair strode right up to the Lovecraft girl, clamped his hands over her hands on the chains of the swing, and only inches away from her face asked,
"Are you playing hard to get?"
Lovecraft stared him out. "You'll never get me, Ed." She glanced towards the other 2 girls. "But you can always choose the easy option."
"Are you calling me easy?" asked tall, spoilt girl. "Are you looking for a slap?" asked the girl with the downturned mouth.
"Neither a slap nor a slapper," replied the brown-eyed girl called Lovecraft. As Turned Down Mouth went to hit Lovecraft, she found her hand suddenly caught in the clutch of a tall boy she did not know. Only a moment before, Robbie had put the coat back to its normal function. Due to the fact that the regulars of the playground had been looking the other way, They had not seen Robbie materialise as if from nowhere.
"Leave her alone!"
High Maintenance Hair demanded of Robbie, all smugness gone for the moment.
"Leave her alone,"
Robbie replied, nodding to the brown-eyed girl still sat on the swing. Robbie let turned-down mouth rip her wrist free of his grasp. Both High Maintenance Hair and his surly sidekick half-heartedly squared up to this new opponent. However, when Robbie showed no sign of backing down or away, they shot alarmed glances at each other. Robbie was bigger than they were, and he looked confident. For his part, Robbie just smiled. The two boys before him were no Anthony Cairns-Nash or Billy Mills. High Maintenance Hair made a show of moving back to look Robbie up and down, which did little to hide the fact that he was retreating whilst trying to save face.
"You're one of the new freaks up at the old church, aren't you?"
Robbie's smile broadened in acknowledgement. High Maintenance Hair continued.
"The builders say that new museum your father's putting—"
"He's not my father," Robbie replied a little too quickly. "He's my step-freak." Now it was High Maintenance Hair's turn to smile, recognizing a weak spot when he saw one.
"The builders say that the stuff he's got in there is seriously twisted."
"It is," Robbie agreed. "So is the man." The gang of four did not know how to react to this, so after several moments' silence, Shirley's sidekick snorted, and they turned back towards the village in the last light of day.
"You and Lovecraft should be very happy together then,"
declared tall, spoiled girl from over her shoulder.
"Freaks together."
By the time they had retreated out of the playground, Robbie turned to face the brown-eyed girl to find she had gone, vanished without the need of a special coat. "Don't mention it," he replied to the empty air. The invisibility mode was a success. Soon, Robbie began to creep into the bog digger's arms in this state of near invisibility, and found the nearby pub to be a fairly dingy establishment populated by a few locals who kept the place afloat almost without any other customers. On one occasion, several nights after the discovery of the coat's functions, Robbie spotted a couple of these locals staring straight at him and realized that his hood had shifted, exposing most of his face. There was silence in the pub as the other locals turned to stare at the partially formed apparition in the shadows. One or two of these regulars made the sign of the cross, but no one made any moves towards him. Robbie shrank further back into the dark corner, and there he remained, stock still. "What is it you want?" called out the man behind the counter.
"It's all Alf. Bet you anything you like,"
declared a bearded authority at the bar.
"Alf? The old landlord of the bog diggers?" "No," replied another regular. "Can't see him clearly now, granted, but he looks too young to be old Alf."
"Maybe it's Alf when he were a nipper.
Maybe that's how the old ghost thing works. Gets younger,"
explained the bearded local.
"Call him then."
"If I knows Alf, I've no need to call him. Won't prove nothing. He took an age to serve me when he were alive."
The bearded authority turned to face Robbie.
"Pint o' Hearty Badger?"
Robbie nodded.
"See? 'Tis Alf. My tab, Ted."
The barman cautiously left a pint of frothing beer on the table nearest to Robbie, then swiftly retreated back to his post. Robbie supped quickly from the glass, downing about half of the strong ale before he began to feel lightheaded and felt he should leave. Most of the pub waited until Robbie had pitched out of the door, then crowded around the windows, but the spectre was nowhere to be seen.
"I was wrong. 'Tain't Alf,"
proclaimed the bearded regular, picking up Robbie's pint glass and examining it sternly.
"Why? How do you know?"
A few of the others echoed each other.
"There's half a pint left there. In life, I never saw Alf leave a drop."
Only once did Robbie nearly get caught, and that was by the brown-eyed girl called Lovecraft. Moments after pressing the invisibility function on his coat, he emerged from behind the statue of the soldier to find the girl in front of him, staring suspiciously. She seemed confused and, thankfully, seemed to have missed Robbie's transition from being unseen to seen. "How do you keep doing that?" she demanded. "Doing what?" replied Robbie. "Getting around without being seen." Robbie was glad that the night hid the panic in his eyes. He shrugged, silently cursed his foolishness, bowed his head and crept back into the museum. Robbie was pleased that the coat had proved to be such a fascinating success in the Bog Digger's Arms and the playground, but what he really wanted to do was to take advantage of it by sneaking into the locked chamber in the old vestry Gabriel Sage had turned into his workshop. Peeking through the keyhole of his own door, Robbie could not help but notice that Gabriel Sage was always cautious and quick when entering and closing the heavy door of the room at the far end of the museum. Intriguingly, there was always a furtive glance cast in Robbie's direction just before the flamboyant figure dashed inside the workshop. Such behavior was a gauntlet in the face of a 15-year-old, especially a 15-year-old who could render himself invisible. Maybe the workshop contains some point of contention that would finally split his mother from Sage. And so, Robbie accepted the challenge.